Hi everyone. In today's video, we're going to go over a variety of methods to make a slab-built cup. So first off, let's go over how to create our slabs. A slab is just a flat sheet of clay that's either pressed, compressed, or rolled out. So you need a flat surface to start with, and I'm going to use kind of a wear board. I like to use loose boards so I can move my slabs around and I don't have to peel them up off tables. I also like to use this loose piece of cotton duck canvas fabric underneath my slab so I can kind of move the slab as I'm making it. So I'm going to make a small slab today because a cup isn't a very large object. So I start by kind of first pre-wedging my clay to work out air bubbles and making it kind of nice and homogeneous and consistent. And then I just kind of form it into, I know I'm going to need for my cup kind of a long kind of rectangular slab. So I'm going to start by just forming my ball of clay into this like log-like shape. And then I'm going to sit it down centered on my board, and I'm going to start just compressing it, pushing down, and I try to do this from the center kind of out in all directions, and it's going to start flattening this slab, stretching and compressing. Okay, now once I've kind of gotten it still pretty thick, but it's still a slab at this point, I can kind of I could use a rolling pin at this point, and I could start rolling it, but I have quite a large rolling pin here in the studio, which takes up a lot of space, but I would again roll from the center out in all directions, because if you roll from the edge, your slab will adhere and kind of roll and peel up, attach itself to your rolling pin. So if you go from the center out, you'll avoid that from happening. Another great tip when you're rolling out slabs using a rolling pin, which is my personal preferred method, is when you get down to close to your desired slab thickness, and in my case I want to make my slabs about 3/16 of an inch, a little bit less than the standard quarter. I take strips of wood that are both the same thickness, and these are my 3/16 strips, and I'll sit them on either side of my slab, flat against the board, a little bit of space between the edges and the board, and I continue the rolling process, and then it'll end up kind of just the rolling pin will just ride right against the wood shims, and it'll be a perfectly consistent and uniform thickness. So that is a tip I would highly recommend if you are going to hand roll your slabs. But for this one, I've pre-rolled some slabs which I'll use, but let me show you how just with a wooden paddle or a small piece of 2x4, something that's just flat and has a little bit of heft to it, you can kind of compress that slab down, get out a little bit of frustration as well. Just keep on kind of banging on it, try to be even. You'll see it start to stretch. You can kind of flip it over, continue to stretch it out. This is actually a way in which you make very strong slabs, because that pressure of slamming down on it with a nice flat surface really forces those particles tightly against each other. It makes for a very strong slab. Okay, now once you think your slab looks relatively even, I would use the flat side of this. There we go. Sometimes when our clay is really wet, it gets a little sticky. Okay, so once we've kind of compressed it, I know I don't need these curves, so I'm just going to kind of remove those at this point with my fettling knife, make it kind of a fairly rectangular piece of clay at this point. Okay, now I could take my shims, place them on either side, and try to compress the rest of the way using a rib. Let's see if I can do that. A little bit of mist. Lie your rib almost flat as you're compressing, so it doesn't scrape the clay, but it's kind of really compressing it. Yeah, this is a really decent technique. See how I try to back this away from I don't want the wood to stick to it. Right, and that makes that kind of nice, smooth, and strong, compressed little strip of clay there that I can now use. Okay, now, once I have that rectangular piece, I need to kind of measure it out a little bit. And I could use a ruler, or I could use the width of my paddle if that's the height, approximately the height of the cup that I want to make. Here we go, mark, mark. Flip it to the other side, mark, mark. Use my piece of wood as a straight edge. Make a line. Make a line. Now, you don't have to measure, you know. I mean, if you're not into things being precise, you know you know who you are if you need to use a ruler. Okay, so now I have a relatively even height on this, so I'm just gonna cut these edges a little bit straighter. I'll probably trim off more when I make this. Right, so now I have my slab that I'm going to use as the wall of my cup. It'll be the vertical wall. So now I need to kind of create a bottom. So I could compress out another piece of clay, or this, I might have compressed a larger one to begin with and then cut a bottom out of it. I have a variety of bottoms here that I'm going to play around with today. But to start with, let's use this circular bottom that I just traced one of my many cans that are kicking around the studio to come up with kind of a relatively symmetrical circle. And you'll see how it's nice to have a loose piece of canvas now, because you can kind of lift that up and it kind of helps kind of you grab that so you don't have to peel it up with your fingernails and stretch and tear your slab. But before I start, I want to make sure that the bottom of my slab that I'm going to stand on top of this is going to adhere to my my circle here. So I'm going to go and score the top of this thoroughly. And then I'm going to put some construction slip. Generous amount on top of that. And I'm really being careful not to get it all over my banding wheel. The more cleanup I have to do, the messier the cut may end up looking. But I just want to make sure it's on top of the scored lines. Okay, now this is a pretty fresh, wet piece of clay, so I think I can get away with not scoring the bottom of that. But if you're kind of really concerned about it, you might as well go ahead and just score all the way along that bottom edge. That's going to make contact with that. So now I'm going to carefully, now when you're dealing with soft slabs, you have to be very gentle when you're handling them because they can easily get messed up and stretched. So now I'm going to sit this on top of my construction slip. I'm going to start kind of pushing down gently on that wall, and then I'm coming around here to the seam, and this is going to overlap. And I'm going to kind of push that overlap together gently. I don't want it to stick. And I'm going to take this fettling knife now, and I'm going to kind of cut the seam here. And I'm doing it on an angle. And I'm going to peel this piece back remove it. Peel the interior piece that was removed. Oop, that's not coming off too easily. It's sticking again. Peel that back. This clay is quite wet, so it's really wanting to stick. Okay, now I'm going to just take that seam and see how when you cut an angle out of it, it just kind of overlaps really nicely and gives you a nice kind of consistently even wall. So I could go and apply pressure with my fingers at this point, holding a finger on the inside just to make sure that seam is well connected. You could clean that up, really kind of do a job trying to hide it if you want. But a lot of people that do soft slabs construction really kind of like leave seams. They want it to look like it was made using soft slabs, and they're not trying to hide that fact. Now all that slip that oozed through the seam on the inside, if you go in with a wood tool to try to clean that up, it's easy to make marks in soft clay. But if you use just a soft brush, a little bit of water on it, and just gently brush that slip, it'll smooth it out, clean it up really easily. Now that clay at the bottom, a couple things I could do with it. I could go around and I could kind of trim it, right, like that, to kind of make it a nice clean seam, and then I could go over it with a wood tool, and so that it kind of disappears like that. Or I could go in and even kind of lift it up like that and blend it into the wall. This is really kind of an aesthetic decision at this point, in terms of what you want to do with your seams, right? If you want them to look visible, or you want them to be invisible, that's totally how it looks, not how it's going to function. Okay, now basic cylinder at this point. So what you can do while the clay is still moist like this, if you want to give the cup some form, change the shape in any way, clay is pliable and it can stretch. You could go in on the inside and you could literally like compress or push the wall out. You see it's kind of like stretching that wall, creating kind of like a rounded kind of belly to that cup, right? Like that, right? You can kind of continue that all the way around to expand the volume if you want to make more of a rounded kind of form. You can go in and holding a hand around the wall, start stretching the wall out, creating kind of a flare, right, to the top, right, of the form. So there's a lot of shape changes that you can do to that basic cylinder after you're just creating that initial very basic shape. You can go in and it doesn't have to be basic, is what I'm saying. Right? There's a lot you can do by stretching and compressing. Now, one thing to pay attention to, it is a cup, so you are going to be drinking from a lip. So you have to give the lip a lot of attention. Don't keep edges really sharp and thin because that's going to not feel good. I'm just taking a wood tool right now and kind of compressing that rim, getting rid of some of the hard edges, kind of softening them, rounding them up a little bit, especially on the inside, so liquid will flow nice and smoothly out of the cup. And then I'm going to fold a damp sponge over that edge and compress and soften that lip. Right, I really think if it's a functional cup you're going for, paying attention to these these details are very, very important, right? Regardless of how it looks, it needs to function. You wouldn't want somebody to kind of like take that cup and not use it because of one little detail that you forgot. Okay, so that's one way of attaching a wall to a foot. Let's look at kind of a different way to go about this. I'm going to set this one aside. And now let's go with a different method here where we're going to build the cup kind of upside down, essentially. So I'm going to take my pre-made slab here and I'm going to form it like I did before, except I don't have a bottom under it. And I'm overlapping that side. And I'm going to cut, same thing I did before, I'm going to cut on an angle here. Right, and I'm careful to hold that wall up a little bit, because it is so pliable, and the pressure of pulling the knife through the clay. All right, so now got that overlap seam, which is so handy dandy. Okay. So that's a hollow tube right now, right? Cup that would not hold any liquid. All right, so now let's talk about how another way to kind of make a bottom. You can kind of compress and bring those walls inward just by kind of gentle compression, right? We can kind of move those walls in, creating kind of a curve, which would make our opening smaller, and then we could attach a foot. But let's talk about kind of something called like making darts, where it's a term used in sewing when flat pieces of fabric are sewn together to kind of form around the body shape. And we can do the same thing with clay. If you cut, let me just do this as a quick little example here. If I cut a triangle right here, right, remove that triangle, right, and then I bring those edges into each other, and scoring and slipping is wise. If you want to make sure that you don't have any leaky kind of seams, you would score, slip kind of both connections there, both edges, right, and then you would bring these in, right, and it brings the wall inward, right? So you could do that there, you could do that on the other side. Let's do 4 similar sized triangles on either side here. And this is going to kind of change the shape. If you're familiar with the Japanese art of paper folding called origami, a lot of those same kind of rules would apply in the folding of a flat piece, but in clay we can cut and remove like I'm doing right now. So I didn't score and slip that to make kind of you see this much more quickly, but you can kind of see how the whole form now is almost kind of gone from a circle, right, to something that's a little bit more squared off because I have 4 corners, right? And if I look at that shape that was made, right, it is not a circle, right? It's a square, right? So if I wanted to then attach a square foot to my cup, I could do that by, right, kind of creating kind of a scored base, right? So I would kind of make sure that that's nice and flat. Then I would score it like this all the way around, dot, 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 dot. Imagine that's really thorough and consistent. And then I would use generous amount of construction slip, all the way around. Then I could basically kind of sit my base over here, or I could just sit this on top and apply gentle pressure, maybe use a little bit of a gentle paddle. Right. Then I could invert that. Whoop. And you can kind of see, now I have kind of a nice circular top, right, where it is the most important part when it comes to a cup, having that kind of that flow for the liquid at the lip. But it's kind of interesting how it really squares off kind of at the bottom here, right, both with the form and with the foot. So there's a lot of things you can do. Cleaning up the inside again, I find easiest to do rather than messing with tools that make marks. I kind of keep things smooth and just use soft brushes like a sumi brush and just brush that slip around that oozed out. If you use a generous amount of slip, you'll have it there. You won't even have to add anything. And that's gonna, dry and smooth out really nicely. And again, paying attention to the lip, right, and that detail. You can wait until the form firms up a little bit more too. You don't have to do all this work when the clay is really soft and pliable like it is right now, right? Because everything wants to move so much. But that's kind of I think that's probably a good couple options right now in terms of kind of creating kind of that cup shape. But really experiment. A lot of people that work in soft slab construction use lots of paper templates where they'll work out kind of their cuts and folds, first with just a piece of paper, and then they'll lay that flat piece out on a sheet of clay, trace it, and then they'll be able to consistently reproduce that same cup or bowl or what have you over and over again. But I hope you enjoyed the slab built cup demo today, and have fun experimenting.